Jennifer, it's great to be with you.
Well, thank you.
So I was impressed with Brandy McHale's comment that it just sucks to be here today. And you know, when I often put it another way is that, you know, what do we do to put ourselves out of business? Those people that are sort of looking at poverty and something that's been endemic in this country and places around the world more broadly. But, you know, how do you eventually get it right? I was sort of looking through very quickly the Low Income Investments Fund partnership book here with the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. And it's basically a playbook. It's called Investing in What Works for America's Communities. So I guess I just want to start here for a minute and saying, is there a way to put us out of business? Is there a playbook to sort of look at a guide like this and solve this problem, whether it's out of the Aspen Institute or LIF or City Foundation? Does somebody have the magic wand to fix this problem?
I would challenge the construction of that question.
Go ahead.
I don't think somebody suggesting one individual, one group can solve this. I think it takes a network of actors. It takes universities, philanthropies, community organizations, governments, private sector, entrepreneurs, innovators. It takes all of the elements that make a healthy society and healthy community working together. And that's why a book like this and an effort to identify the quarterbacks in the communities is so important. Efforts need to be linked and reinforced. That's how you work at the Atlantic, right? You ask somebody what if they know about a good idea and they point you to somebody else. That's how ideas happen in the private sector. If you look at something like the collaborations that happen between companies to share ideas and advance on the most complex problems. These are our most complex problems in society. So why do we act as if a little bit of philanthropic money here or a government pilot program there can make a difference when we don't rely on individual actors to create this kind of large-scale change in any other venue? So I think it's possible, but as Brandy said, it's only possible if we approach the problem differently.
Now, you founded the Center for Urban Innovation at Aspen. I just want to jump in here for a moment. Do you profile places where that network has worked exceedingly well? Because as you describe it, I can think of lots of communities around the country that have all those players, but they come out with mixed outcomes in terms of what they produce, particularly in dealing with neighborhoods that need a lift from LIF. How does that work? But you know, looking at how to get, you know, later we're going to have Shirley Franklin here, whom I really admire and has achieved something that's unique, where it's a combination of both leadership, but you also have to have a lot of trust and competence among those other stakeholders. So what does your center have to say on that element of the network you talk about?
I think when you are trying to make change within underserved communities, it's important that you work with and not on, for, to, around, over, right? All of those other prepositions. I think a lot of errors have been made when people, extremely well-meaning, well-educated, armed to the teeth with data and big hearts, people go into neighborhoods and don't look for partners, we look for problems. And we talk to people about how broken they are and all of the pathologies, and we don't see some of the good things that happen. We don't see some of the neighborhood strengths that we can build on and emerge. So finding the innovators within underserved neighborhoods, for example, that's what I'm trying to do. I want to create a new kind of relationship or a bridge between the recognized communities of innovators, so that's entrepreneurs, universities, all of the entrepreneurial infrastructure, right? The accelerators, the venture capitalists, the impact investors on the one hand, and underserved communities on the other hand, so that innovators are working as partners with underserved communities, and that underserved communities can recognize their own innovative potential. There's all kinds of problem solving happening in underserved communities. So how can that be harnessed to all of these larger networked resources? My center is just about 3 months old. So we don't yet have our, well, thank you. I say I'm out of the first trimester, so I no longer wake up and want to throw up every morning. So our effort is to find and foster these partnerships, and then again tell the world about them and show that this different model can achieve better results.
So that's a very interesting comment, that underserved communities, in a way what you're saying, need in part to pick themselves up by their own bootstraps and figure out how to connect as opposed to waiting. I mean, it sounded a little bit to me like there's a responsibility on their shoulders. Brandy talked for a minute about Baltimore, and part of me wonders how many Baltimores are out there waiting to blow. And when you look at that particular part of Baltimore and what didn't happen, what were the points of misconnect between both those that may have been trying to do something to that section, as opposed to the forfeiture of responsibility within that community itself?
I wouldn't use the bootstraps language and say that it's.
You use something more polite.
Well, no, I think something more accurate, right? Which is, there are leaders in these communities, and they are working very hard. And why do we, or how can we give these leaders the same access, again, to networks, capital, entrepreneurial benefits, recommendations to scale, that we give people working on other issues or in other parts of town? So I think that I think it's really hard to be poor, and I think it's really hard to work in poor communities. So it's not my place to say that people who are poor are not, doing their part or living up to a particular responsibility. I think what happens in Baltimore and in a lot of these communities that sort of go up is there's not an understanding of all of the range of supports that healthy communities have, or that well-resourced communities have. So we focus on housing, but housing is only one element of a sustainable life. We don't think about work. We don't think about transportation. We don't think about all of the elements that make it possible to advance in society. So we think of it in silos, and that doesn't work. That's not how middle-class people approach their lives. It's not how higher-income people approach their lives. So why do we expect it to work in lower-income neighborhoods?
Is there a concrete example you can think of where you've seen a dramatic transformation with things like transportation corridors or resources that have come into a community?
There's a group in Houston called Neighborhood Centers Incorporated, and I believe they're profiled in this book. They're profiled in a book that I co-authored with Bruce Katz at the Brookings Institution.
Is that the Metropolitan Revolution?
The Metropolitan Revolution, yeah. Thank you for saying it.
There's an Amazon link.
So what Neighborhood Centers does is they look holistically at communities, and they start by going into a community and saying, what do you like about this place? Who are the leaders? So they really have a very respectful approach. And then they focus on the variety of supports that communities need. So they have a bank for people to stop sending all their money to payday lenders. They have health clinics in their neighborhoods. They work on transportation solutions, but they work with the city. So, for example, they worked with the city of Pasadena to implement a more robust transportation system to get workers to and from Houston. So that's an example of an entity that doesn't go in with, they don't do any one particular thing. They don't do transportation, or they don't do health. They do what needs to be done. And I think those are the most successful solutions, rather than trying to think that the processes, I think, are the same to support communities, but I don't think the outcomes are always going to be the same. So you have to have an openness to what the community is really telling you that will benefit them.
When you look at, when I think about this question, there's so many different pathways. When I look at a lot of the communities, particularly the African American community that are impoverished, the incarceration rates of men are staggeringly high, and that dramatically changes their prospects. If you read David Leonhardt's piece the other day about if you're born in that neighborhood in Baltimore and don't escape the gravity of it, as Brandy just said, you're likely to sort of continue this multi-generation cycle of poverty. When you look at the cases where a lot of people who have lost their jobs, as a part of the financial recession, and had some health hit. So there's health, there's crime, or misallocation of penalties for crime. There's a lot of stuff that goes around the question of what makes an impoverished neighborhood. And when you think about changing that vector, it seems to me, don't we need to kind of work on all of these arenas simultaneously? And so how do you approach that?
I think you approach it with humility. I think you approach it with no one sector or no one actor saying that they have the full slate of resources or ideas or a monopoly on what's good. And I think you look at it kind of at the human scale, right? So people need housing, they need transportation. There was another piece in the Times, also in their Upshot column today, that talked about transportation, reliable access to jobs as probably the single most important factor in a family's economic success. It overwhelms the effect of education even. So quite simply, how do we get people from here to there in a reliable way? I think we start with what we have in place. I think we start with what we know. We know that we need to do a better job at making it easier for people to get from where they are to where the jobs are. And then that creates a whole system of supports that are required, whether that's childcare, whether that's continual updates to job training. We just need to do a better job of thinking about work as one of the central organizing forces of people's lives.
How much of the system do you think still has sort of legacy biases built into it? My colleague Ta-Nehisi Coates, in his piece on reparations, essentially wrote, these communities were designed. They were created as a matter of public policy, redlining, racism, left them. If you go down and talk to Mitch Landrieu in Louisiana and talk about moving jobs and people across the state where they need to go, they said part of keeping a certain socioeconomic class of people struggling is by design of certain folks that have it all. And it's a very provocative notion, because here we're talking earnestly in almost a philanthropic way that it shouldn't be that way. But how much of the system, from your experience, is still stacked against the people who don't have the resources, don't have the transportation networks, that there's a built-in bias that we need to acknowledge more publicly?
I think there is a built-in bias. I think, probably everybody here has read Crabgrass Frontier, which is sort of the definitive history of how redlining happened in the United States. That has generational follow-on effects, right? So that the people, I heard this on NPR the other day, the people who moved out to Levittown, the white people, right, and spent $8,000 for a house, those houses are now worth $400,000, $500,000. That wealth has trickled through the white families. Black families who were moved into rental housing didn't have the opportunity to have to get on that sort of wealth escalator, and those multi-generational effects are still with us. I think, though, what we want to do when we design policies now is think very hard about designing policy with the right combination of ambition and humility, because a lot of the policies of the past, I'm not talking about redlining, but there are a lot of policies of the past that look really stupid now, but they were designed by people who were just as smart and just as well-meaning as we are today. So when we think about policy and when we think about action, how can we also think about making it flexible enough to accommodate changing circumstances, because we'll only learn more, and how do we make it easier to correct our mistakes as we go along? Both the mistakes of the past that are obvious and intentional and really demeaning, but also, and this is somewhat more poignant and more heartbreaking, right? The mistakes that we never intended to make, that didn't look like mistakes at the time, but are now causing some of our most challenging problems.
I assume you're familiar with Shirley Franklin, and what she's, so I've got her coming up later to talk about this. What did she get right in that, and what are the lessons from that experience that aren't relevant to other cases?
I think one of the things that that she understood was the importance of the sort of full-on community, and certainly in the work that she's doing now around building real communities, not just housing, but housing, jobs, services, so that people live in environments where they can see work happening, right? One of the mistakes of the past, I think, is that we made such a separation between where people lived and where people worked, and we expected people just to sort of figure out the connection. We expected children to be able to understand work and the processes of work and the benefits of work without actually seeing it happen around them all the time. And so I think that, that integration is really important. That integration, though, will look different in different places because you have different local laws, you have different tools, you have different geographies, right? You have different configurations of job centers and housing. So again, I think the process of figuring that out would be transferable from place to place. The exact model probably would need to be tweaked for different geographies and opportunities.
I've just been told we have 2 minutes. I'm going to be sure to ask Shirley Franklin what I should have asked you and didn't, so Shirley, don't worry. Now, other questions? Questions from the floor? Yes, right here up in front.
Hi, I'm Daryl Sun from Deloitte and formerly a Singapore government executive. And
congratulations on your transition.
Thank you. And I just wanted to ask, what do you feel are lessons you can learn that American cities can learn from cities internationally, whether it's Singapore, it's cities in Brazil, cities in Canada, or other...
Gum chewing and, you know,
yeah.
I'm just joking.
I think one of the things that U.S. cities can learn is how to build and retrofit cheaper and faster. I think there is a kind of, I don't want to say lighter touch, but there's a sort of new approach to urbanization that we're seeing in these emerging economies. There are cheaper approaches to affordable housing. There are cheaper and more flexible approaches to mass transit. And as we retrofit places like Houston, like Atlanta, from a single car dependent or single occupancy car dependent places to mass transit, we won't be able to make them look like New York or Washington with this extensive underground subway system. So what is Rio doing? What is Cartagena doing? It's my understanding, although I haven't studied it very well, that Latin American cities are also rethinking what low-income and affordable housing looks like. And maybe it's built on a more communal model. Or maybe we experiment with more flexible building types and zoning codes and building tools. I think that has a lot to teach what a kind of more modern and flexible infrastructure can look like.
And we can take one last quick question, comment. There's not one yet, so we're going to move. But let me just ask you, just in closing, about finance, because part of what is being discussed today is solving the deficits in the economic equation, particularly with responding, I think, as LIF has been trying to do, to look at the infrastructure, community centers or transportation things that just wouldn't have gotten funded, and then solving, you know, these are high-risk areas, and money doesn't like to go into high-risk places. So how much is the financial, the dollar part of this important beyond the network? Because you've got money and cents issue, dollar and cents issues here.
Yeah, I think money is important, and I think one of the things that governments can do is not only to make direct investments in philanthropies as well, but to help shape and create and nurture markets. We talk a lot internationally about quote-unquote bottom-of-the-pyramid solutions, and people understand that the margins on the sort of world's low-income people are small, but there's so many of those potential consumers that you could make a lot of money. How do philanthropy and business help identify and shape markets so that these underserved communities also look like interesting places to invest? And again, so that people within these communities who, you know, when it happened in poor neighborhoods, we called it the underground economy or the black market economy. When it happens in rich neighborhoods, we call it the sharing economy, right? How does government make a platform so that both of those are recognized and supported? Because the market is probably is going to be a bigger force than government or philanthropy. And again, when you look at a history of redlining, or when you look at how infrastructure investments can raise value, governments are really powerful at priming and creating those markets.
Thank you for setting the context for today and getting us launched. Ladies and gentlemen, Jennifer Bradley. Thank you very much.
Thank you.